Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was the third president of the United States and also a founding father of the United States. He was also the first Secretary of State of the United States, which is our point. He was notably portrayed in the musical Hamilton from 2015. His introduction song was What Did I Miss?, a jazzy number that describes the events of Thomas Jefferson returning home from France and becoming the new Secretary of State. There's a lot of context behind both of these events. They're deeply rooted in the state of the world and of America at that time. The events of the song occur in late 1789 to 1790. This is shortly after the start of the French Revolution. At the same time, the U.S. was just discovering how to be its own country after its independence from Britain was declared in the Treaty of Paris of 1783. The Secretary of Treasury at the time, the same time that Jefferson was Secretary of State, was Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton and Jefferson held vastly different beliefs, Hamilton leaning more towards Federalist values, wanting a more united and government-oriented society, and Jefferson holding more Republican values, and advocating more for individual rights and agrarian society. Jefferson's arrival in America is one of the main story points in the song. He came back on November 23rd of 1789. The French Revolution had started just a few months before that, in July of the same year. Jefferson had been in France since July of 1784. He was there with Benjamin Franklin and John Adams to negotiate trade relationships, and just relationships in general, between the U.S. and France. While there, Jefferson became the U.S. Minister to France, a position that he held until he became the U.S. Secretary of State. And then, of course, after that he returned to the U.S. in November of 1789. The other main story point in the song is Jefferson's new position as the Secretary of State of the U.S., which is led into by his arrival in America. Jefferson was chosen by George Washington to be the Secretary of State. This was for a few reasons. First, it was because of Jefferson's experience as the U.S. Minister to France. He had a lot of good experience in foreign policy in a time when the country was struggling with that. As a new country, one of the most important things for America was to establish itself among all the other countries and to figure out relationships with those other countries. And especially as a country that split off from Britain and was allied with France, foreign policy was very complicated and the government needed to have someone that would be able to manage that. Jefferson also had very different ideals from Hamilton. Washington wanted a government that had people who would disagree with each other and bring up new points in order to have a government with lots of ideas. The basis for this is that Hamilton tended to have more Federalist ideas, and Jefferson had Republican values. The story that What Did I Miss tells us is, almost accurately, a series of events that changed the course of U.S. history. It tells us about Jefferson's return to the United States in November of 1789, and his new position as Secretary of State starting around 4 months after he came back from France, and, shortly after, the cabinet debates about Hamilton's financial plan. However, not everything that the musical tells us is entirely truthful. The main glaring untruth in the song What Did I Miss? Is the timing of the events as told in the story, the song being as fast-paced as it is, and including lines such as, I have my first cabinet meeting today, which is stated by Jefferson immediately after he becomes the Secretary of State, gives the listener the impression that all the events are happening closer to each other than they actually are. While Jefferson becoming Secretary of State and the cabinet debates happen very close together, there's no guarantee that they happen on the same day. This also happens with Jefferson's arrival to the U.S. and him starting his position as Secretary of State. In real life, these happened about 4 months apart, as Jefferson came back in late November of 1789, and he became Secretary of State in late March of 1790. In the song, however, these are told consecutively. There are also some things that the musical leaves out. Some details about Jefferson joining the government. First, Jefferson was unwilling to join the government. He thought the government was doomed, almost, because of Hamilton's involvement. He also changed his mind about a lot of things after his time in France. There, he witnessed the beginning of the French Revolution, a huge fight for human and individual rights. This caused him to petition for individual rights more than he already did, which pitted him against Hamilton, who believed in government supremacy more than he already was. And another thing about Jefferson's ideals. He was, a hypocrite. He was very, very in favor of individual rights, letting the states govern themselves and not putting as much pressure on people, but he was, famously, a slaver. He was denying people the very privileges that he preached. This often caused a lot of discrepancies and contradictions in his arguments, which affected the outcome of the first cabinet debate, as described in the song Cabinet Battle No. 1. The song that comes directly after What Did I Miss is Cabinet Battle Number 1. It describes the cabinet debate that Jefferson has immediately after becoming Secretary of State.
In the Hamilton musical, Cabinet Battle 1 is a rap battle between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Throughout the battle, they take verbal jabs at each other's political ideas, with George Washington stuck in the middle trying to keep the peace. But how much of what we see on stage really happened in history?
After the Revolutionary War, America was sad and broke. Each state racked up a lot of debt, and the economy was struggling. While they were a British colony, Americans enjoyed the highest standard of living in the world at the time. The average annual income was about £13.85, and the tax rate was only 1 to 1.5%. However, the colonies did not get many civil services or public funds because of their low tax rate. And this carried over until after independence because the colonies had no bank to manage funds, there was no federal program to provide civil services, and the economy was cooked.
The musical correctly explains several points. For example, Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, had big plans to fix the struggling economy. His idea, known as the Debt Assumption Plan, is correctly explained in the line, "His plan would have the government assume states' debts." Hamilton thought that pooling all the debt would unify the states and give the country a fresh financial start. Hamilton also wanted a national bank to manage the country's money.
People like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison weren't so thrilled. Southern states had already paid off most of their war debt, so they felt like Hamilton's plan was basically asking them to help bail out the northern states. As it says in the musical, they felt that if New York's in debt, why should Virginia bear it?
Jefferson thought it was dangerous to put so much financial power in the hands of the government, and he saw it as a move towards a more elite system. Jefferson wanted each state to have its own banks, keeping the money close to home. Hamilton's plan felt way too similar to the old British system that they had just fought against.
George Washington was stuck in the middle of this fight. He respected both Hamilton and Jefferson and knew the country needed both of their talents. Washington didn't want their arguments to tear the government apart, so he pushed them to find a middle ground.
Eventually, they came up with the Compromise of 1790. Hamilton's financial plan would go forwards, but the U.S. capital would be moved to Washington, D.C. to appease Jefferson and his supporters. The National Bank was established in 1791. Hamilton executed the first financial bailout in 1791 by injecting $560,000 into the U.S. economy after the National Bank stock fell. The musical significantly plays up the drama of this scene. In Hamilton, Jefferson and Hamilton both have some bold, direct lines, dissing each other's ideas in ways they probably didn't in real life. In real life, the meeting was much more respectful.
Washington was also not as stern as he's shown in the musical. He encouraged compromise, but he never ordered people around or abused his authority. He was known for listening to his subordinates as a general and his cabinet members when he was president.
In the musical, Hamilton makes points on slavery, saying we know who's really doing the planting. In the song, Hamilton points out that Virginia's economic success is due to slavery. In reality, Hamilton opposed slavery, but in the cabinet battle, he didn't talk about it. This topic is brought up for dramatic effect.
A lot of decisions and conversations were had that were not open to the public and not documented. Because historians don't have access to these letters, we also don't have full view over exactly what happened.
We also don't know if the Southern leaders disliked Hamilton's plan because of personal reasons or if it was ideological. For example, opposing Hamilton's plan would allow Jefferson to have slaves and make him more wealthy.
Thanks so much for watching, and be sure to hit that subscribe button, smash the likes for the algorithm, and hit the bell icon for notifications when we post some more
awesome sauce content.